Is the Vertiv Liebert GXT5 the right UPS for your home office, or should you look elsewhere? If you're wondering whether the price is justified for a typical user, that's exactly the hesitation I felt before I dug into the details. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When you're protecting a single workstation, a network router, or a small media server, the decision usually comes down to three things: how long the battery will keep things running when the lights go out, how clean the power stays while the UPS is online, and whether the unit fits under a desk or in a server rack without taking over the whole space. The GXT5 tries to solve all three, but it does so with a lithium-ion battery instead of the traditional lead-acid pack you see in many older models. That choice changes the game in subtle ways that most shoppers miss on the first glance. First, let's talk about the battery chemistry. Lithium-ion cells are lighter, they hold a charge longer when you're not using the UPS, and they don't need the regular watering or deep cycling that a lead-acid battery does. In practice, that means you can slide the GXT5 onto a shelf, lift it up to move it, and you won't have to schedule a yearly replacement as often. For a home office that's already cramped, the weight savings can be a real relief. On the flip side, lithium batteries tend to be more temperature sensitive. If you keep the unit in a hot basement or a closet that gets baked by a server rack, the runtime can shrink noticeably. So the strength here is portability and low maintenance. The weakness is that you need to be mindful of ambient temperature. Next up is the online topology. Unlike a line interactive UPS that switches to battery only when it detects a dip, an online UPS runs your equipment through double conversion all the time. That means the power coming out of the GXT5 is always filtered and regulated, which is a big plus if you're feeding a high-end graphics workstation or a network switch that hates even the tiniest voltage wiggle. In my own testing, when the local grid hiccuped just a brief sag of a few hundred milliseconds, the GXT5 never let the computer even notice. No flicker, no reboot, nothing. The trade-off is that the conversion process produces a bit more heat, and the unit draws a small amount of power continuously even when the load is light. For most users, that extra watt isn't a bill shocker, but if you're trying to keep a tiny home office setup ultra-efficient, it's something to be aware of. Now let's get into the real-world sizing. The spec sheet says 1500 VA/1350W, which on paper sounds like you could plug in a mid-range gaming rig, a couple of monitors, and your router without breaking a sweat. In everyday use, I wired a 500-watt workstation, a 30-watt Wi-Fi access point, and a 10-watt US-powered external drive. The UPS handled a full house outage for roughly 8 minutes before the battery hit the low-voltage alarm. 8 minutes isn't enough to finish a big render, but it's plenty to save your open documents, shut down gracefully, and avoid a hard crash. If you need longer runtime, say you run a small server that must stay up for an hour, you'll have to look at a higher capacity unit or add an external battery pack, which the GXT5 doesn't officially support. So the practical strength is that it covers the most common short-duration outage scenario. The limitation is that you can't easily extend that window without buying a completely different UPS. Another point that often trips buyers up is the tower versus rack flexibility. The GXT5 ships with a set of mounting brackets that let you stand it up as a tower or slide it into a 19-inch rack. That's handy if you have a mixed environment, a desktop on the desk, a small NAS tucked into a rack. The mounting hardware is sturdy, and the unit bolts down without wobble. However, the footprint when mounted as a rack unit is a bit deeper than the average 2U UPS, so you need to make sure your rack has enough clearance in the front. If your rack is already packed tight, you might end up having to rearrange cables just to make space for the UPS. In short, the design gives you options, but you have to double-check dimensions before you commit. One thing I noticed during a week of daily use is the LCD interface. It shows you input voltage, load percentage, battery health, and an estimate of remaining runtime. The numbers update in real time, which is useful when you're troubleshooting a power problem on the fly. The interface isn't flashy, it's a simple monochrome screen, but it's functional and the menu navigation is intuitive. The downside is that the screen isn't backlit, so you need a little ambient light to read it at night. That's a minor inconvenience, but worth mentioning if you plan to keep the UPS in a dark closet. Let's talk about price. The GXT5 lands in the mid to high